World War soldier killed during World War II have been identified more than 80 years after his death, according to the Defense Prisoners of War and Missing in Action Accounting Agency. Private Willard D. Merrill of Dover-Foxcroft was captured by Japanese forces in April of 1942 while defending against an invasion off the Philippine Islands. Official records state Merrill died inside a prisoner of war camp in November of '42 and was buried in a common grave. Merrill's remains were exhumed in 1947 but were declared unidentifiable, and he was buried at the Manila American Cemetery and Memorial. In January of 2019, the DPAA exhumed the remains once again for analysis, and he was positively ID'd last year. Merrill will be laid to rest in his hometown of Dover-Foxcroft in June. He was 21 years old when he gave the ultimate sacrifice.